So we'll get back to work. We've reached the last straightaway of this symposium, and as you've seen since yesterday morning, we've spoken a lot of social banks, postal banks. What will be the social impact of postal bank, and what role could it play faced with the banks, and what services could it offer to certain groups of society and to unions? So we want to study that impact. So we thought that we'd organize a roundtable to discuss of the social impacts of postal banks. So we have three people who'll discuss what is happening in their country and their points of view concerning loans, payments, the role of banks, and the postal service. So we'll hear them one after the other, after which we'll have a debate. So the first spokesperson is Isabelle Fleurence. She's the Federal Secretary of FOCOM, Force Ouvrière Communication from France. She's been involved in the union for many years, has played a role within her union, has worked on the referendum that was organized concerning a postal bank. So Isabelle has been very militant, and she'll discuss other aspects of a postal bank. Isabelle, it's up to you. Thank you, Denis. Welcome to you all. As Denis said, I come from the union Force Ouvrière, and I bring you the brotherly greetings of our Secretary General Jacques Dumont. He wishes you a lot of success in this political activity. I'd also like to tell Denis and the members of CUPW, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to this symposium. I've found it extremely interesting, and I think it's a very courageous initiative on your part. I think it's a good idea to create this postal bank, and all this has been very interesting. So I'd like to speak of the financial impact, the social impact on citizens, and the impact also on members of the post office. So concerning citizens, that's not the right one. These are not the right slides. I completed these slides last night.
Parce que on s'était pas concerté avant de venir, donc.
So I checked with my colleague, and so as not to be redundant, I redid my slides last night. So we have it on a stick, and we're going to bring it back to the technicians so they can put up the slides. Oh, I'll go help him find the proper key.
Je vais commencer un peu sans les transparents.
So I'll start without the slides. Now, our postal bank in France is the future for the post office, we believe. Its purpose would be to supply about 65% of revenue for the post office in 2016. Our situation in France is similar to what you see elsewhere. There's a great reduction in the volume of the mail until 2013. It was the post office that presented the revenue, and this year it's 50% from mail and 50% from the bank. And for 2020, our objective is to have a net profit of 1 billion euros. The bank is taking more and more importance, and this bank wants to be close to the citizen. We want to have a good public image. That's the way we advertise ourselves in the media. And we've also renovated the offices of the network of post offices so that they will better welcome members of the public. We set up ATMs. We have agents who welcome clients who come into the post office. We also have financial experts to meet the needs of our clients. We don't sell them anything possible, but we look into their personal situation, their family, so that we can offer them the proper product. So we have a good image as a postal bank because we're close to the public. And we're linked also to the Postal Service, so we have a very good image. We are in the third rank of banks, although we're very small, and we're right behind Crédit Mutuel and Crédit Agricole, who are very big French banks. So here we go. So this offers more access to banking services, and we can reach 99% of the population. All French citizens have access to the postal bank. We have 17,000 points of contact, and there's even a law that states that a French citizen should not be further than 5 kilometers away from a post office. So we're very close to our clients. Now, as we're a state bank, we have a mission, and in the union, since the creating of the postal bank, we fought very hard so that this mission, this social mission, be respected. And we want to be subsidized by the state for offering these services. The CEO of the Postal Bank want to show that we're close to the citizen. So our slogan is a citizens bank. That's the new name of the bank this year, the Citizens Bank. As we said yesterday, we're the only bank to receive the poorest citizens of Canada because the law states that we must offer services to everyone. So we receive the most disadvantaged that are rejected by the big banks. Banks should receive and give accounts to the poorest, but it's costly, and so the banks reject them, and they can come to our postal bank. Our costs are the lowest for clients. So our bank distribute family allowances. We distribute the RSA, which is the minimum income given to the unemployed. We also distribute unemployment insurance. Now, that these payments are made to citizens mostly at the beginning of the month, which means that our post offices are very busy during the early days of the month. We also have phone services and the internet service. So at the beginning of the month, it's very hectic, and since the financial financial crisis, people need these state support more and more, and it's very hectic at the beginning of the month. Since the financial crisis, we've seen a reduction in civility in our post offices. Our wicked clerks are often insulted. Sometimes they're actually physically abused. They are slapped. They're thrown things. So the union is trying to work to reduce this conflict and this violence. And we want to find a way for the wicked clerk to react when he's attacked. So we have special training for this. We also work with doctors. And when the post office worker is fed up with these attacks, he can go work in the back office. So if you create a postal bank, you'll have to be careful of violence at work. Because of the financial crisis, we've seen a great increase in violence in the workplace and insults and rudeness towards workers. So we offer different kinds of accounts. We offer the Livret A. It's a savings account, and that has no cost. But the postal bank has to pay for these services, and we are subsidized by the state, but the subsidy is too small, and so we have a deficit of 25 million euros because of this service. So we will renegotiate with the government in 2014. It seems that the subsidy will go down once again for the Livret A, and we should see an increase in the deficit. So we offer credit cards. When the people present this card, which is not accepted by all businesses, it's a kind of a debit card. But this shows that the person has no money, no credit, and it creates certain stigma. So now we're working on distributing prepaid credit cards that can be used anywhere, such as Visa or MasterCard, and this will not stigmatize people. We also created a service for the poorest that we call Support. It's on a telephone platform in the financial center in Paris. There we have 30 agents working in that service. As I was saying, the financial crisis has increased the level of poverty in France. And because of this, we end up with clients who are very poor. They have difficulty in paying their bills, such as heating, electricity, and rent. So that service Support exists to link them, to refer them to social organizations that can explain what their rights are. Very often these poor people don't know what their rights, so we prepare them, we give them the information, we refer them, and for housing, if they're close to losing their housing, we refer them, and we also put them into contact with government services that can help them. So we created this service Support last year. It's already working, but we want to continue developing this support service to help poor citizens. We also provide loans to individuals for the construction of social housing. That's also a new activity. And we also make loans or micro credit loans to individuals. The Crédit Immobilier of France used to do that work, but they went bankrupt last year. So now the Postal Bank has taken over that activity with the Caisse d'Épargne. And right now, we offer the most microcredit loans. Since we are a state bank, the state has forced us to hire 300 former employees of Crédit Immobilier de France. That's imposed on us by the state. Now, the Postal Bank is not just a bank for the poorest. We're a bank for all French citizens. We also have middle-class customers, and the basis of our clients was the middle class and seniors. So in the past, we couldn't make loans. We've only been able to make loans since 2006. So in the past, the average age of our clients was older. And since we didn't offer loans, young people would get an account when they were young, and when they became 17 or 18 or 19 years old and they needed loans for a car, for example, they'd go to the chartered banks and we'd lose them. So we've seen an aging in our population, and since 2006, since we can offer consumer loans, we are working very hard to have access to these younger clients, to try and get the youth to come back to the Postal Bank. But that's not enough to increase our revenues. So we've also developed a wealth management bank for the richest people. We couldn't do that alone because we didn't have the infrastructure to do that. So we bought a little bank for Bank BCE. We've bought this 2 years ago, which allows us now to offer these wealth services. We've also developed loans for companies because we've taken this over after the bankruptcy of Dexia, and the government ordered us to take over some of the activities of the bankrupt Dexia Bank. Another activity to increase our revenues, LBP intends to develop small and medium business loans from starting in 2014. So SMEs will have these accounts, and in the past we couldn't offer them loans, but starting 2014 we'll be able to offer SMEs business loans, and we'll create 1,000 jobs for advisors who will be working with these small and medium-sized businesses. So our strengths and weaknesses. The Postal Bank has real potential, but we have difficulty in being accepted by the market. Most Canadians, most Frenchmen see us or give us a good reputation, but we're not considered as a bank for large investments. So that limits our market share. Our market share is now about 8%. When you include everything, insurance, loans, bank accounts. And so we can make loans to our customers, but they don't invest their salaries in us. They don't come to get credit cards in our bank. They trust other banks more than the Postal Bank for these services. But We do have a good image, and we do have potential, but we lack innovation and creativity. In digital services, for example, we sell mobile phones, but we don't yet propose payment through the phone service. That will come, but we don't have it yet. The physical postal network drains 82% of our revenue. So we want to offer more and more bank services in our network, and out of our 17,000 post offices, we will train our staff to offer these different services. This will have an impact on our members, and so the union will have to be very vigilant. Here I can establish a link between what we do and the impact on our staff. The post office workers, we've lost 80,000 jobs in 10 years in the four main activities of the post office: mail, financial services, and parcels. So the staff that worked at the postal bank have two levels. We have 2,250 people who are considered bankers, and the others, of the other 55,000 employees who work for the postal bank, are seen as state employees. So in 20 years, postmen and women have been trained to offer financial services. We had two statutory reforms, 3 European directives, and a great number of reorganizations and restructuring. And this was very difficult for our members. In the past, our members would offer a service, but they weren't salesmen. They didn't know how to offer more services. We had to train them to do this. And at the beginning, training was insufficient. The union had to fight a lot to get proper training. And I propose that you do the same thing here in Canada. We had difficulty training our people. For example, people had a new product to sell, and there was no training for selling that product. So they discover it at the same time as citizens. And very often members were unhappy. It was very difficult because the bank and the post office was not giving the proper training ahead of time to the staff. So the union fought to get that training. And in our financial services, we signed an agreement on banking services so that every time a post office worker was sent to the bank, he'd be accompanied for training, for the career development. And I'd also like to say that the average age of our staff is 46 years old, which is rather old, and that created difficulties also. So we had difficulty also in integrating our IT, and some of our staff left for high tech. Since 2013, 17,000 people were shifted to commercial activities, 29%, and in 2014 it will be 55%. So 2/3 will become involved in that activity. So a new reform has been proposed for 2014, and that is to merge the work of the bank and the postal outlet network. Up until now, the bank had their own staff, and we had the impression that things weren't working well because there was no synergy. The banking services would say, oh, it's a fault of the post office, and now they're talking about a merger of the two. with a lot of work for the postal office, because the Philippe Ball was president of the postal bank, and now he's president of the network. So we have many bankers who become members of management. So that we hope will be better for our customers, and we want to develop our so that we can offer more loans and do some risk management. Our postal bank was seen as being a success story because we started with nothing, but we were able to create the postal bank through the investment and the work of the postal workers. So we trained postal workers to offer these commercial services. They became very dynamic, competent, professional, but we also recruited people from the outside who came from existing banks or from schools of commerce. Since the financial crisis, it's easier for us to recruit people who have business experience because we are more stable and we offer a better future to young people in our postal bank. We've also worked at recruiting youth coming out of school to become a financial advisor. A young person after their studies will spend 2 years, half at school and half in the bank, and they get a specialized certificate, and then we try to hire them in our postal bank. We also do the same thing for university graduates, which allow these young people to become part of top management. So we also want to create the banking school to allow better training, and this banking training school will have a diploma equivalent to university diplomas. This has just started. I can't tell you too much about it because it's just starting, but this bank training school will allow people working in our postal bank to have more knowledge. We've also worked a lot on career development. You can be at the bottom of the ladder in the post office and reach the top rungs through internal competitions, and this banking school will also allow these members to go up the rungs of the ladder. A young person will be able to spend all his career in the postal bank, and people who are already there can transfer to other positions, and will offer them career development. Now, concerning salaries, people who work in the commercial bank have fixed salaries, but they get commissions. This creates social repercussions on the staff. And I'd like to draw your attention to this. We have staff members who are very stressed. They're constantly asked to do more, sell more, without more support. Management, of course, is not very humane. So the union is trying to work to fight so that training is more human and that the commercial activities become more humane so that people do not receive as much stress as they do now. This stress has created terrible problems among postal workers in the last few years. So be very careful if you set up a postal bank, because this new way of working creates a lot of stress. Tomorrow is a World Day of healthy working conditions. In Force Ouvrière, we had several tragedies at the postal bank. So tomorrow, our militants will give this little bracelet to all postal workers to show that safe conditions at work is a priority. And we must do everything to have decent working conditions and to have good conditions. So that's it. The creation of a postal bank, I think it's a very good solution. And I think it's the proper solution to face the reduction in the volume of the mail. In all the countries, we see the same situation. So I think that you'll need the help of the state to create this postal bank and the support of citizens. The public decided they needed these services of a postal bank. Citizens usually trust the post office, they trust their letter carrier, and that allows us to gain more market share as a bank. We're also looking for original solutions in the mail service. If you have good ideas, tell us. We'll welcome these ideas, and I hope you'll have a lot of success. I think you'll succeed in creating your Canadian postal bank. Good luck, and thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Isabelle. At the beginning of your presentation, you were really talking about things that are things that postal workers have done throughout their lives and their working lives in terms of keeping neighborhoods safe, looking after seniors and so forth. So there's really a connection with the public. And we're seeing that with the postal bank that is enhanced. The social aspects of the bank become very important. That was clearly demonstrated. But we also see how management operates as well. They use that to try and pressure workers to get them to do even more work. And that's something that we see as well at Canada Post. But thank you very much for bringing forward that dimension of the postal bank in France, which is at the same time a socially oriented bank.
Lewenza Jr. So he's working with Unifor, but he's working too with a group Making Waves. So he's working the region of Windsor, Ontario. So and is involved with this group to talk about what I call what we call here the payday loans. But it seems that we have to change our vocabulary around this issue. So I'll let him explain what they are fighting and how it be important for us to be part of it. So Ken?
Good morning, everybody. First of all, Denny, thank you very much for allowing myself to be a part of this very important weekend put on by CUPW. I also, again, want to express thanks to my own organization, one, for giving me the opportunity to come and express solidarity on behalf of Unifor, but at the same time thanking them for providing me the space to do some community activism, working with groups that you're going to hear about in terms of making a difference on these particular issues. I just want to provide a little bit of context for you. About 2 years ago, Start Making Waves, or Making Waves, started off with about 90 movement organizers, strategic thinkers across the country that essentially came together to talk about how it was that we can fight the corporate agenda, neoliberalism. We were saying, what was it that we had in common? It felt like our democracy is under attack, our rights were under attack, our environment, our public services, jobs, you name it. So the one common link or point of convergence for all of us was that we were fighting corporate power. The other part of it is, going home, we knew that if we were going to have success organizing, that we were going to have to build some local templates. So I want to thank some of the national players that have been a part of this, as well as some local players that have been a part of a little bit of what you're going to be hearing about. So in Windsor, we had an assembly, and we termed it Organized People Can Beat Organized Money. And what we wanted to do was identify linkages, what were some points of convergence, think about how we could work outside of our silos and how we could support one another, how we can experiment with new forms of organizing, how we can think about how we can empower the base and support that base when people did come out. And one of the really important things I want to touch on that's relevant to this conversation was there was a group called Voices Against Poverty. And one thing about Windsor in our community is unions, especially unions, have done a wonderful job making contributions with charity through the United Way. And one of the things that they were very clear about, and these are people that are even, some of their agencies and organizations are actually funded by the United Way. They said, we don't need more charity. What we actually need is we need more organizing. We need more education on the street so that we can actually fight the neoliberal agenda, because the reality is that inequality is going to grow at a rate faster than our ability to provide charity. And so one of the themes that they wanted to start organizing around was around the topic of predatory loan sharks. And again, we're not calling it payday lending institutions. We're calling them exactly what they are. They're predatory loan sharks. This was a first initiative. It was basically a pretty easy initiative to launch because obviously there's such little support, regardless of people's political stripes, in terms of how much these organizations or institutions are harvesting the Canadian public. The reality is, and just a little bit of context on some of these predatory loan institutions, is that about 15% of Canadians don't even have access to basic financial services in our country. And part of that reason is, the number one reason is the banks simply aren't interested in these particular people. So they're essentially forced into these types of locations. We know that in Canada, anything over 60% interest is called usury, and it's actually against the law to charge over 60%. But these predatory lenders actually skate around that by adding in a whole bunch of extra user fees. And I just want to give you a sense of this. My friend Richard, who I met during the Occupy, gets a $230 check. He doesn't have financial services. For him just to cash that check, they charge him $30. So he's left with $200. There's another woman, Angela, that we've been doing work with in the community. And again, what an excellent woman, fallen on some hard times, had a pretty good middle class lifestyle, but again, because of the economic hardships in Windsor, has fallen on tough times. So she receives a social services check for $400. About 6 times a year, she goes and uses one of these predatory lenders. To get an advance on her pay, they charge her $90 for a 1-week loan. So you're actually looking at about 500 to 1,000% interest. But when it's a choice between keeping on your utilities and paying other bills, it's just a constant juggling act for these particular individuals. In our downtown core in Windsor now, it's kind of, you know, when you see predatory lending institutions popping up, it's actually a sign and a symbol of how poor your economy is doing. When you actually start seeing cash stores setting up in different locations, because the reality is that these cash stores are actually going into underprivileged neighborhoods, and that's where they're most setting up. We had a strategy. One of our first strategies was that we wouldn't have a mass mobilization. We would just call a press conference, and it was an opportunity to relate to Windsor Essex residents exactly what was happening with these particular institutions. And one of the things that was interesting was we actually got good media out of it. And in Windsor, it's like this class war is just constantly going. And it was interesting that even the comments in the Windsor Star from people that were writing in were incredibly supportive of actually getting rid of predatory lending institutions, and people were actually asking the question about what type of alternatives they were. One of the places that we picked to demonstrate in front of, or where we had the press conference, was in front of the cash store. And the cash store was an institution where the province of Ontario has just recently rescinded their license to actually do lending. For example, so they can cash checks, but they can't do any lending. And the reality is the reason why they actually stopped them is because they act like the wild, wild west. So even as bad as some of our governments are, the reality is even our governments are seeing how horrible these institutions are and what type of havoc that they're bringing on our communities. An interesting point, though, when we were having this strategy conversation about how do we move forward, when we had talks with the poverty communities, one of the things that they were saying was, well, we don't want to get rid of them. So, well, what do you mean? What do you mean we don't want to get rid of them? We don't want to get rid of them because what's going to happen to us? Where will we get these services? There's no other place that actually provides these types of services. So there needs to be alternatives. So I just want to say, Denny, that there could have been no better time to have this type of conversation about postal banking. And now what our group and our community is saying is we actually want to learn now more about postal banking. So obviously the work that you're doing here this weekend, we want to bring people into Windsor-Essex County so that they can begin to start to understand what are some of the alternatives. It's one thing to always be against something and speak about injustice. It's another thing when we can actually hold up viable alternatives where we can replace some of these institutions. Just some of our next steps. On May 6th, we're actually calling for a bigger demonstration. And at this demonstration, we're going to be launching a petition. One of the points that we're going to be advocating for in our petition, out of the 2 points, is that Canada Post be granted a limited banking charter to start providing these types of services where we can get this petition around the community. We can start doing education with the community and expressing that this is an actual viable alternative to, again, the public being harvested by these private sector loan sharks. We're also going to be inviting groups. For example, if we're going to have success, it's important that we think about how we can work together. I know that Acorn Canada has done some wonderful work in different areas against some of these predatory lending institutions from other jurisdictions. We're actually inviting them. In our last demonstration, we actually invited some good activists down from London because there is an absolute plan that even in Windsor-Essex, we're not going to win in postal banking by just having these protests or demonstrations in one particular location. We need to think about how we expand it beyond the province, throughout the province of Ontario, and obviously beyond. And I certainly congratulate Quebec for just banning predatory lenders outright and providing some partial solutions. The other thing that we're going to raise at the demonstration is what type of society do we want to live in? How are workers treated in these predatory lending institutions? How are they paid? What type of jobs are we creating? What type of society are we going to have where on one end workers are treated poorly and on the other end customers are being harvested? And I know that there is a report that was put together by Canada Post. A lot of it's blacked out by the Harper government. And it actually does insist that there is alternatives that's actually good for consumers and it is good for workers as well. We're also going to go after the banks. And if you look at, for example, the banks have actually pulled out of some of the poorer neighborhoods. And what's replaced the banks? The predatory lending institutions. Adding insult to injury is the fact that the banks are actually investing in these predatory lenders. So there's an interesting little marriage there. So the things that the banks really couldn't do directly are now doing indirectly through predatory lending institutions. And our whole thought around the whole concept around making waves was challenging corporate power, going after the pillars of power. It's not one thing just to go after politicians, but actually how do you go after the centers of and the deep-rooted structural problems and start identifying it for what it really is. Another point that I want to add is just the myth of the private sector providing choice. The predatory lenders provide an excellent example. On one corner, you can go to the predatory lender that has the blue sign. On the other corner, you can go to the predatory loan institution that has the red sign. The other corner that has the orange. That's simply your choices. And I think, again, the conversations that you're having here this weekend are actually providing Canadians and citizens with real choices as opposed to what's currently being offered. And I want to mention sometimes the right wing provides us some wonderful gifts and wonderful opportunities. And it's important that we are actually organized so that we can take advantage of these opportunities. And I again mentioned linkages. We had an editorial writer in the Windsor Star who's absolutely rotten. And they started a column, and it was talking about getting rid of the panhandlers. And he referred to them as pests that need to be exterminated. They talked about how to actually get them out of the downtown core. And one of the more interesting facts here was that a city councillor was supporting this particular initiative, and obviously speaking very rudely to people that are in the most vulnerable within the community. The interesting part is that city councillor that he was teaming up with is a leading mayoral candidate for Windsor-Essex County. And so what we're actually going to do at our demonstration, and oh, by the way, through this article, it was talking about if you were a citizen walking through the downtown core that you got to run the gauntlet of these panhandlers. And it's so ironic when you actually look at the opposite, when you actually run the gauntlet of these predatory lenders that are every second storefront. So we're going to use that example, and what we're going to suggest is that instead of actually going after the poverty community, let's sit down and have conversations, stop the grandstanding, and how could you actually be part of the solution? And we're going to challenge that city councillor to be the very first person to sign against that predatory lending petition. If that city councillor doesn't sign that petition, we're going into his ward. And we're going to create the biggest mass mobilization in our community around that particular issue, because we need to stop having conversations in communities about personalities, and we got to talk about values and what they represent. The reality is, do they stand on the side of these cash store predatory lenders, or do they stand on the side of the people, and do they stand on the side of actually providing solutions? So even whether or not that city councillor signs or not, the next step is on May 28th, 29th, we know that CUPE is holding the convention. And the reality is, if unions are going to have success organizing, we got to make better connections with those in the community. And this is a perfect opportunity where unions can actually join together with the community, stand behind them, and say that we want to get rid of predatory lending. But at the same time, we want to support CUPW in their efforts to fight for postal banking. So I just want to conclude my remarks by saying that, we're working with groups like London. We're thinking about how we can do some grassroots things to really expand this. This just isn't a worker issue, a CUPW issue. This really is about what we want our society to look like. Thank you very much. Yeah, so
It's important to show the poster.
so we've actually put up a site on our internet, and it's called Making Waves Windsor Essex. The interesting thing is when people actually sign on to this particular petition, not only are we asking for them to sign on, we're really using it as an organizing tool, because we're going to ask people, would you like to learn more about this particular issue? Would you like to get involved? And the reality is, if they'd like to get involved, if they'd like to do some door-to-door, we're going to do some training. And if they'd like to learn more, we're going to set up some schools. I know that we've had some conversations with CUPW to, again, have conversations about understanding these predatory lenders, understanding that there is alternatives. So we see this as an opportunity to rebuild the progressive base and, again, start to put forward alternatives that more reflects people.
Thank you. So thank you again, Ken. I think it's really stimulating to see how we can share our struggle and our fights around this issue. And what Linda McQuaig said yesterday is the fact that the postal bank can be a key point in a progressive agenda. That show it. That show how the fight and the struggle of all the people trying to have a better world can link together. And I think the fight we're in, so we will be there around this issue. And I think Acorn is here today, and we have some fight with Acorn around remittances all the time with this kind of group. So I think now we will have to talk about them, about the predatory loans sharks. So that's the way. And you said something at the beginning I think I want to repeat, because I think when you said organized people can beat organized money, I think that's something we have to keep with us. It's something strong, saying when we are well organized, a good structure, and the people together, we will win this fight. So thank you, Ken. So our last speaker is Rousseau. So he's a CUPW member. He's a worker at Canada Post. He is the president of the White Horse Local up north. So Ron is at the same time the vice president of Aboriginal people at the Canadian Labour Congress. So since last meeting, and we are going to the convention next week, and he will reoffer, and the board supported him. And Ron will talk about something. What happened with the postal and banking in the northern part of the country, to give us some idea around. Maybe there's something we can push a little bit more there. So, Ron?
Thank you. You know, as I'm here to talk about First Nation issues, and first of all my name is Nimki Peason. It's Thunderbird in Ojibwe. I'm Ron Rousseau. I'm the Aboriginal Vice President of the Canada Labour Congress. I'm the second Vice President of Yukon Federation of Labour. I am the President of the Whitehorse Local, and I work 8 hours a day on top of that. So we're very busy, and we're trying to take on lots of the struggles. So I'm going to break it down into two different things. So I'm going to talk about postal services and banking and First Nations. And some of these First Nations in northern Canada that are instead of third world conditions, you know, with very limited water and housing, and you know, this all instead of a Canada, whereas you know, we can walk down the street here and see some of the most fortunate people that are out there, which are off of our backs. So I'd like to go back in history about 6 years ago and talk a bit about postal banking. Is Canada Post 6 years ago was talking about doing postal cuts on First Nations post offices, which are contracted. There's about 300 of them normally inside of northern Canada. So I came to Ottawa, presented to the National Executive Board, and with the help of Denny Lemlin and the National Executive Board, we sent letters to the Assembly of First Nations and the political parties, asking them not to be cutting the services, taking the post office inside of communities that are, you know, the post office is absolutely necessary. You know, as we use the post office to be, you know, receiving goods, supplies, clothing, and even food. You know, some of these are fly-in type communities or very, I'm trying to think of the proper name. It would be like very distant, right? You know, you're talking driving several hundred kilometers to get to the nearest place. But they also send things like artisan products and furs. So with this is talking a little bit about the money is, you know, they use money orders to pay for bills, you know, CODs, collect on delivery, to be receiving, and MoneyGrams. Outside these communities, not a lot of people have credit cards, and you know, these are pretty much a necessary service. So with this pressure that was put on Canada Post by both our union, the Assembly of First Nations, and the political parties, is Canada Post did the right thing. You know, they were looking at doing these cuts because they were transforming and they were going to a point-of-sale service, which is a computer service inside of all the post office, and they did it. And you know, I think they did the right thing. And once again, I have to thank our allies for standing up with us. So that's a little bit of a start of where the post office is absolutely necessary in First Nations. Now let's talk a little bit about banking. So I went out and I did a survey, and I did a drive into the northern Yukon. My first stop was Pelly Crossing. I walked into the post office and did a transaction, and I said to the person, I said, so what about the bank? And she goes, well, that's this door on this side. So I said, well, who does it? And she goes, I do. And I said, what do you mean? She goes, well, you know, on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday on the post office, on Tuesdays and Thursdays on the bank. And so then I drove 100 kilometers south, 300 kilometers across, and I went to a community called Ross River. And right outside on the building was two signs, one saying Canada Post Ross River and one saying TD Bank. So what I did is I went off and I said, you know, what can I do? And she said, well, you know, is inside the same little office, which is pretty much a hole in the wall, is one side was the point-of-sale system and the other side was the TD Bank. So you could do both services. So I bought the stamps and asked to do a transaction, and she said that, you know, she can't do it because she's been told not to. I think they knew I was coming. I then drove to Faro, which is a CPA office, which I had to drive by, popped in and said hello and asked about what was going on. And you know, she said that they didn't have the postal banking, but they were side by side. And she talked a little bit about the cuts and what's going on inside of her community with the post office and how the hours are being cut and the effect on a small community. I then drove to a place called, back another 300 kilometers, and stopped in at a place called CarMax. Inside of CarMax, I went over and it was inside of a small store, and I asked, what the postal service was like, and she goes, well, I'm a small franchise and just opened, and I said, so was it not inside the First Nation band office? And she said it was, but Canada Post had some issues with them, and they came up with a resolution that they could no longer work together, and she took the post office. But meanwhile, is on Tuesdays and Thursdays, you go to the band office and deal with the TD Bank. So that was my day. I did about 1,000 kilometers. Started about 5 in the morning. Got home about 9. So it was quite fruitful inside of the information that I got out of it. From there, as the next day, as I spent the day making phone calls, I called Old Crow, and which is a fly-in community, northern Yukon, which is very small and has some really desperate situations for the people. So I asked the postmaster. I said, "So what goes on?" She goes, "Well, as I work for the northern store, and I work at the post office, and I do the bank on the First Nations," which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. I then called Burwash, and Burwash Landing is southern Yukon, and I said, so what's going on here? And she said, well, as I can do banking and postal services at the same time. And I said, well, what do you mean? She goes, well, I'm open 5 days a week in the morning, and I do them both. So she does them both at the same time. So I think there's a little bit of a sort of a segue there. So I decided to call around and go into northern BC. I called Iskut, BC, and I said, how are things at the post office? She said, good. And I said, what about banking? She said, we have no banking. And I said, so what do you do for banking? She goes, well, the band office does everything they can, but, for anything majors, we have to drive 500 kilometers to the closest bank. So she said, it's pretty much the same thing inside Telegraph Creek. So I called Telegraph Creek and I said, what's going on? He said, well, we got the post office, but we can't do money orders or MoneyGram or CODs because they don't have the internet lines in there. So they pretty much run a very basic type service, and they said that the banking is really a huge problem because of Dees Lake closing. So then I called Dees Lake, which is another CPAA office, and said, how are things? And she goes, well, is our roof's caving in and we have to come in the back door, but besides that, everything's okay. And I said, well, what about the banking? And she turned and she said, well, the TD Bank here closed about 2 years ago, and it's really caused some hardships. And I said, so what are the hardships? She said, well, the store cashes checks for those that need it. And I said, well, what do you mean they cash checks? She goes, well, they'll cash checks that are either government checks, band checks, and let's be clear about the government checks. These are going to be unemployment checks or social assistance checks. And I said, so, that's pretty good. And she goes, well, no. She goes, when you were talking, 10%, 15%, and even 20% if you're, not that popular, I guess, is so when you talk about somebody going in with a social assistance check for $1,000 to feed their family, taking 20% is $200 really goes a long ways out of a family's pockets. So I think that there's a lot of room for growth, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about the contracts and the deals with the TD Bank and what was going on inside the northern Yukon. About 10 years ago, Northern Services was dissolved, and at that time, so was a lot of the departments. So I went through my old contact book and started looking at people that I'd met along the way, and I spoke with one person who said, she goes, well, I was the one that set up the contracts. And I said, what do you mean you set up the contracts? She goes, well, inside the Yukon, the closest bank was the TD Bank, so we made the agreement with them. We would take the First Nations and the bank, and we'd talk about the square footage of the post office, how they could share the costs, about taking the time of the worker and sharing the cost of the worker and expanding the time. And so these were set up inside most of them, like the Old Crow, Pelly, Ross River type of ones. The one that was inside of Northern Stores, which was inside of Old Crow, was a little bit different. That was a national contract, and what they did is they agreed that inside of all the Northern Stores and on the First Nations is that they would set up the post office and they would share the costs once again, except for it was a bit of a different scenario, whereas the Northern Stores was liable for any losses and not the person that was working behind the counter. So, as we talk a little bit about where this is going, and I think that, it's being proven that it can be done. It hasn't been done in a while. There's been no new ones signed. I was speaking with some of the CPA yesterday who said that, these had actually been inside of some of their offices and no longer are. When we talk about postal banking and people, is especially northern people, because when we talk about some of these communities, they really do live inside third world conditions with inadequate housing, lack of water, and postal banking will help the conditions for the Aboriginal people, both living in the communities as well as inside the cities. The government of Canada has a responsibility to provide affordable postal services and banking to the First Peoples of Canada. And once again, I think that we have a better way of looking at this, and I think Canada Post and the government needs to do the right thing once again and stand up to the plate for my people. So last, as I'd like to say, in closing, I'd like to say merci, thank you, Gunas Chish, and just for the sign language, and thank you.
Thank you, Aaron, for being here and share with us, all of us, your experience about banking and the situation of the First Nation in Yukon. So I think it's important when we're talking about banking, when we're talking about changing situation, that people go there and have the experience and check exactly what is really happening around banking and postal service from some of the communities in this country. So thank you for that. So now we're opening. So if there's question, comment around how the issue about postal bank, social bank, and how we can fight around that issue and all of that. So it's open. Brother from Australia.
Yeah, thanks very much, everyone, for your presentations. Very good. I've just got a question surrounding the predatory loan sharks. Just got the thing on my table here. I'll go to that rally, but I'll be back in Australia by the time that's on. So if you've got a video link, I'll jump on. Now, you were just mentioning how there's no real groups out there who are supporting these mobs, even on the right side of politics. What have you done to enlist the sort of groups who may be on the right side of politics who are against this, and sort of having them as part of the coalition as well?
We're just in the early stages of bringing people together. In fact, it was probably just about 3 weeks ago when we decided to take up this challenge. So there is going to be a lot of communication with the community. It's going to invite people to come in and have conversation. So we'll certainly get there and try to organize as many people as we can around this particular issue. I guess the other part of it is City Council. I forgot to mention, when we do have the even larger demonstration on the 28th and 29th, we're going to be asking all municipal politicians in our community to sign off. It wasn't just the one. The one was just an opportunity to start for the first 20 days. And then from there, we're actually going to head out to our provincial, our MPs, which is provincial, and then we're going to head out to our federal. And I know that Jeff Watson is from Windsor-Essex. He's a Conservative MP, and we're certainly going to be, having some type of exchange, and hopefully see what we can do about organizing in that district anyone that stands up in favor of predatory loan sharks.
The brother, confrère.
Merci. Thank you. I had a question regarding what will happen next. Maybe in continuation of the debate. We just saw that there was a huge possibility for the creation of a Canada Post financial institution. Let's put it that way. So that is to help those who are unbanked, the underbanked, and the panhandlers, which is a terrible word. So is this part of the work that CUPW will be doing? Will you be offering a new economic model? That will be the big question that will be asked after the first question that we ask. Given the network and given the opportunity that is there to serve these unbanked and underbanked people, there will be terrible opposition. But the opportunity is there. There is the real possibility that this project could materialize. So are you going to be working on that? For instance, what is your next agenda? And since you're targeting the electoral calendar, what are you going to do? You're working with CUPW and the community and elected representatives. How are you going to do all this? Maybe it's too early to answer my question, but that is what I'm asking myself. Well, we will take note of your question. When we are done with the social aspect, then we'll answer that question. By the way, I wanted to touch on that aspect in the conclusion of the conference, in my concluding remarks for this conference. But in terms of the presentations that you've heard, do you have any questions or comments? Well, I have one myself for Isabelle, because I'll use the word contradiction, because people want to do the work. For instance, in terms of what you call the commercials, they want to do the job, but at the same time, there is this pressure from the employer who keeps asking for higher productivity. So how can you as a union deal with this situation? People say, well, I'm going to the commercial sector, but it's going to be much harder. There is the psychological pressure, and there is the fact that you have to deal with the public. How did you cope with that contradiction? You, Isabelle, and Nicolas, because it could be a key aspect of what people are wondering about. What you have to realize right away is that some people decided to go to the commercial sector because they were constrained to do that, because the non-commercial sector was taken out, so they had to go to the commercial side. As a union, what we do is that, I did talk about it briefly and vaguely, but we do negotiate agreements in order to improve their working conditions within the commercial sector, by which I mean that we work on the objectives and we try to ensure that they're collective objectives and not personal objectives to reduce the pressure they're under. And then there is the management change. We worked as a union. We're still working on this to make sure that the managers are more humane and to make sure that they should not always be focusing on statistics, that they should equip the workers so that the workers can be more productive without being overly stressed. And on professional development, the union is also working to ensure that people can enjoy some professional advancement within the commercial sector. And we also ask for guarantees, job guarantees. It's not enough, obviously. The training issue, we worked on that a lot to make sure that the training is easier, but our bigger problem is the management pressure that we have to get rid of, so that the commercial sector workers can work in good conditions and not be stressed out and be allowed to do their work. There are some commercial businesses where you're forced to sell things just for the sake of it and forget about the client's needs. And customer service means that you should sell what the client wants, but not just sell them anything at any price. So, Nicholas, if you have anything to add, go ahead. Since the creation of the financial service and the commercial side of the postal service, well, there's always been this contradiction, because we're public workers, and most of us, we've been mostly been public servants, and there is that contradiction between being a public servant and having to meet the needs of diverse clients. And then there is the pressure that comes from being there just to make a profit. We know that, and all the services that we're involved in, including counter services, are affected by that. Sister?
Hello, I'm Bev Ray. I work with CUPW, and I'm actually from Edmonton. I found it interesting, actually, listening to a number of the different speakers over the weekend, and the one thing that keeps coming out is the relationship between government creating services such as postal banking and the impacts in terms of our social safety net for all Canadians, right, for all people. Isabelle, I was curious about, you mentioned with respect to the postal banking and the financial crisis that had gone on, the impacts that were experienced by probably the most vulnerable within your community, and that the banking service was providing additional supports such as information to the most needy on their rights, directing them towards housing. And it seems like that was a responsibility historically by government, certainly in Canada. And I'm curious whether or not the government provides additional funds for the employees that are working in that postal retail network to actually provide that kind of support and service to individuals. So that's one question. And then I also had a question for Ken, because I'm very intrigued about this whole thing about going after the predatory lenders. And I know in Edmonton years ago there was a fellow by the name of Peter Fade that was with the Edmonton Social Planning Council that was looking at establishing some sort of small lending co-ops for people that traditionally would not be able to get any kind of support or service from the big banks. So I'd really be interested in getting as much information from Making Waves and what Unifor is doing, because I see that as being a really great way to continue escalating and promoting the idea of postal banking right across Canada. Thank you.
Isabelle,
Sorry. Concerning the support services that were created, it was really to put people in touch with the relevant services. It's not our postal workers who meet the needs directly, their housing needs, for instance, but they direct them to the relevant housing authorities. It's an initiative that the citizen-centered bank decided to take on to help those who are really underprivileged. It's an internal government bank policy. It's nothing to do with the government. The only payment we get from the government is for the passbook, where we're subsidized every year. And that subsidy, as Nicolas said yesterday, is distributed now. That passbook is distributed through the bank. And given that that France is trying to cut costs at all levels, all public services and universal services that we have to provide French citizens at the post office, well, the state subsidy has been reducing every year, and this year will drop again. In terms of the distribution of the newspapers and the passbook, our subsidy will be dropping again, and that will be destabilizing us. Our innovation is at the level of microcredit because the housing loan service in France that was providing that service went bankrupt. So the two major banks distributing this is the Postal Bank and the Savings Bank. And it's been operational for a year now, but basically people are turning more towards us than towards the savings union. And banks are not interested in microcredit because it means helping the poorest segments of society. And for that, they've been abandoning major chunks of the market.
Oh, Ken first. Okay, Ken first. Ken.
One thing I'd like to clarify is just even the role of Unifor, and I think even the labor community. This whole concept around making waves was really about thinking about what role labor has in facilitating some of this good work on the ground. For example, there's lots of good organizations throughout this country that are doing great work with a little bit of resources, and I think we need to have a conversation about how do we actually support that base? How do we listen? Today there's debates going on in this Canadian Labour Congress about what role that labor plays. And I think it really is about listening to people in communities and what are the most effective ways of fighting back and thinking about how we share power. And I want to say at the grassroots level, I mean, we have CUPW members working with Unifor members and CUPE members and teachers, and to have this level of collaboration where labor's facilitating that activity is, so I just want to be clear that although Unifor has put a lot of resources over the last couple of years into thinking about, it's about building that template or model. As it relates to, you mentioned other groups that were challenging this particular initiative before. The key point here is I think there's moments in time, and I want to give those groups tremendous credit for the excellent work that they've done towards social justice in raising this particular issue. In fact, when we were putting this together, we actually did some research based on what some of those groups, and that's why I mentioned ACORN and giving them recognition for the wonderful work of going into neighborhoods and communities, thinking about how to organize around this particular issue. But the reality is now that the linkages and the interest level of taking them on now, because before it was just seen as a community issue, a poverty issue. Now all of a sudden, workers are coming together and saying this is obviously a much broader issue. So the more groups that we can bring together for this particular issue enhances our opportunities, obviously, to win.
Brother?
Thank you very much for your presentations. I am Kevin Spirits, and I am involved in a local organization called Solidarity Against Austerity. I have a question for Isabelle. I want to know about the attitude and the actions of French banks and financial institutions in France towards the Postal Bank, even at the parliamentary and political level, because I guess that we know in Canada that the banks are very powerful and they're active in the political circles. If we want to push for postal banking services in Canada, I guess we will be facing a major challenge because of the power of the banks.
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question. Well, the Postal Bank in France, for the time being, is not competing against the other French banks because we're small, and so far we can say that we've provided service. We've actually been doing a service to the other banks because we are there to provide a public service to the most underprivileged. What we're doing is basically what no other bank wants to do. So there is no competition between us. The services we're providing, the A-Passbook, and the assistance we offer to the most underprivileged, and the social assistance and the social service we render, it doesn't eat into the gross sales of the banks. So we're not in competition with the banks. But where the competition will get tighter is in the credit services, because because of the credit crisis we've been in since 2008, we were well positioned. Our postal bank, we were well positioned given the rates we were offering clients, and we bought back a lot of bank credit. But we're a small bank, so we did not really compete seriously against them so far. But as Nicholas was saying yesterday, often when we offer loans to clients who are already with banks, even if our rates are very competitive compared with bank rates, the bank is ready to lose money to win back their clients. So the problem we really faced a lot was that we would offer loans to clients, but we weren't equipping them. We're often the second bank that the average client will go to. We're often their second choice. They come to us for what they find interesting, for instance, an interesting loan rate, and then they go back and invest with their bank. And we still have a lot of trouble retaining those clients who come to us for the first, and to being able to sell them added value products to our clients, to the new clients. It's true we're a small bank, but our growth is upwards, and for the time being, we don't scare the big banks in France yet. So we're really a small bank and based in France, and we're not really a competitor. As far as for now, maybe in a few years things will change if our growth rate keeps exploding. Now let's go to the net, because we have brothers and sisters watching us, and we have a question from Francis in Montreal, who wants to know, and the question is for Isabelle. The question is, how have you so far managed to juggle between the social aspect of your work and the search for profits? How do you try to reconcile both in your work? Thank you for the question. In our work, well, our counter postal workers have to do both. The commercial work is done at the counter for simple operations, and for more complex operations, for instance, investments and life insurance and credit services and car loans and for death the duties, it's done by experts. So the social a component of our work is at the counter and in financial centers where there are client services that have been created, and there are telephone services where you call those clients and provide them services. But our specialized advisors also deal with those clients. For instance, when it comes to microcredit services, people who are applying for micro loans, they also have to talk to our experts. So there is no classification between rich and poor. We treat everybody the same way, but those who have more specialized needs will talk to specialists. While simple operations are carried out at the counter and by phone. It's not a major problem so far. So we treat everybody the same way, and rightly so, because as a union, we have to treat people equally. Concern.
When Isabelle mentioned about the training and having some difficulty around that, the training wasn't adequate, or that seems to be what happens here with Canada Post a lot. Whenever we have new initiatives, we always find that the training is not adequate, not enough to move forward. We had a bank in Nain, Labrador. It was in there from 1995 until just this past year. Several years ago, the Bank of Nova Scotia decided they were going to pull out of Nain, and the other one was here in Ontario, Moose Factory. They did pull out of Nain. They did pull out of Moose Factory. However, they did not pull out of Nain. What they did, they canvassed a community and doubled their customer base. So it was clear to us they had no intentions of pulling out. What that created was a whole bunch of different problems, because they weren't allowed, Canada Post did not renew any kind of a contract with the bank to increase the hours of banking. if they had 3 hours of banking per day, that did not increase. So here we had our employees, our members were being squeezed, and then we had customers from the community, they weren't happy because they had double the customer base, but they didn't have the adequate time to deal with the business that was there. So as we move forward, I'm hoping that this is something that we can address, and we won't have that issue down the road, that every bank, whether it's in the northern service or in the northern region or in a centralized region, that it's not a cookie cutter, a one-size-fits-all. There's different needs and there's different challenges that we're going to have to meet, and hopefully we can move forward with that. Thank you.
Commentaire?
Do you have any comment? Yes. At our postal bank, things are a bit different because the bank was created and has survived. And what happened is that staff was transferred. People who were doing counter operations that were simple, like selling stamps and processing parcels and processing money withdrawals and money order deposits, and they were transferred to the commercial sector, and they were expected to do even more at the counter. So these commercial banking workers, well, 50% of the postal workers in the postal network were sent to do commercial work, and we're now at 23%. And we trained them initially rather poorly, and as a union, we fought for them to get adequate training. So twice a year, we take stock and we send the record to unions as to the training offered to the staff. There are staff training programs, and we focus on the training required. Hence the creation of the banking school for people to be even better trained. And the key thing we did was that we negotiated an agreement for when people change jobs, and so that they should receive upstream training, and they shouldn't be limited to their working, they shouldn't be left in their working position without training, because the novelty was that on-the-job training on a new product was also offered, and we ensured that that should be insured, provided so that people can gradually train in a training school environment, so that it could be done gradually. Given that the products we sell are evolving and we're selling more and more of those products, they often try to make people rush their training. But as a union, we fought against that. Crash courses, and that is beginning to yield fruits. People are better trained now. We're not at the top level yet, but as far as training is concerned, we're getting more training, and we keep fighting for people to get even more better training. And they shouldn't feel inadequate before the clients, and they should also have what they need to do their job. I don't know if I adequately answered your question.
Mais je voudrais encore dire une chose.
I would like to add one more thing. When you create your postal bank here, as you said, it's important that you ensure that the postal workers are trained adequately so that they can feel at ease in their job. As a union, you have to stress the need for training, because otherwise, the staff who have to do commercial services, they might feel ill at ease, and to reassure them, you have to give them training, especially when people change jobs.
I just wanted.
Okay.
I have a question.
Bob.
I have a question and a statement. My statement is: it seems we have no boundaries. Our issues are the same. Whether it's delivery dates being shortened, or processing plants closing, or trying to start a bank, or having a bank and having the issues that we have just having a bank, the political problems. I think. This being my first conference, my eyes are opened. It's an amazing organization. I'm thrilled to be here. My question is for you. These predatory loans, are there any organizations in America that you're aware of that are going after them, these companies?
Not that I know of yet, but like I said, we still have a lot of research. Look forward to working with a lot of partners. And so not as of yet, but I would have to believe so.
Okay.
You know, they're just so crooked and rotten that I'd have to believe that there is some groups on the ground. The question is how can we have better coordination amongst ourselves?
And the other part I wanted to just, again, add to it is the political problem. We have the right to start a bank. We're having the same problem Canada is having with postal management. We're going through the political arena, trying to change it. The Republican Party is fighting us tooth and nail. They don't believe that we should be able to have an organization that can take care of the underserved. They have closed 1,200 banks in urban areas in the last 2 years. 1,200. We're in every zip code in America, in every corner of America, and we have the ability to do it just like Canada does. And again, attending this conference really opened my eyes, and thank you.
Just on the United States in terms of some options, and again, certainly not an expert, but I believe it's Vermont that's doing some interesting things with its, for example, credit unions, where they're actually using the credit unions as mechanisms to help pay for some of the social investments that people want to see. So I think as you move forward with this whole concept of postal banking, it's really starting to think about how we can do this and how the general public can actually benefit from, the investing in a public service, so that, again, that reinvestment can go back into society as opposed to in the pockets of the elites.
You?
My question's for Ron Rousseau. And first of all, Ron, I wanted to thank you for your eloquent and powerful speech describing just the lack of basic infrastructure in the First Nations communities. And my question for you is, in terms of looking forward, if postal banking became a reality and was present in First Nations communities, do you see it playing a role in helping those communities move from the subsistence kind of level they're at now to perhaps achieving greater prosperity and having the tools available to people who live in First Nations communities to move forward in terms of having a more prosperous future?
As I do, there's a few things sort of that goes with this. I think that the places that are sitting back and charging exorbitant amounts to be cashing checks will no longer be able to do that. And I think that, we, looking at a postal bank, can do a better job than the large banks that are doing it now. Because, we look back about a year, with a prime rate of about 3.5%, the line of credit rate, I think we paid about 6%. About a year ago, we all saw them jump to about 15, which is, there was no need for it except for profits. And we're seeing, $35 billion profits coming out of some of these companies, whereas we need to be providing a service that's going to be there. And, and we're talking about putting money back into the people that need it most. And I think that the First Nations in this country really need to be looked after by both Canada Post and the government. And I think this is a step in the right direction. I just wanted to make one more comment outside of this, is about the size of Canada and the size that we're dealing with. When we talk about Isabelle coming here from France, I came the same distance in Canada. And I only came about 2/3 the way across the country. So when we're talking about a postal bank and making sure that the post office stays, is, the large centers is what subsidizes the north. Mailing a letter across the street here in Ottawa is going to cost you $1. For me to mail a letter from Whitehorse to Iqaluit, going to cost me $1. These are the types of services that are absolutely necessary. And I think that the postal banking in itself can, make profits enough to ensure that, we have the proper service. Thank you.
D'autres questions, d'autres commentaires?
Are there other questions or comments?
Sure, about what they did, what they put to this debate. So thank you very much. Here's a little of our appreciation.
Thank you very much.
Donc, il nous reste quelques minutes pour...
So we still have a few minutes. maybe we can use these minutes to answer Nicolas' question. It was a very interesting question. What will the NEB do? Now, we at CUPW, and it's the same thing for CPAA, they were talking about closings and the reduction of hours. So we're being attacked from every angle. There's PT, the employer presented new technology that's eliminating jobs. So we're fighting to keep our jobs and to face the negative impacts of this new technology. Canada Post has attacked our salaries, our benefits, our pension fund, and they have received direct support from the government to force us to return to work and to force us to continue bargaining, on which our members voted. After that, there was all the pressure exerted by Canada Post in referring to the pension fund, saying, oh, we have a deficit, we won't be able to supply money to the pension fund. That was another aspect of this attack. And then there's the support of the media that Canada Post has received. You have the April 2013 Conference Board report saying that the only possibility for Canada Post to survive is by cutting services, cutting their traditional services, also cutting manpower, cutting home delivery, reducing the days of delivery, cutting down postal counters. So we're being attacked every which way. And we can see the 5-point plan presented by Canada Post that says we have to eliminate home delivery. We have to increase the price of stamp in a usurious fashion. We must eliminate postal counters. We must increase the use of new technology. And for the next bargaining round, we will again attack working conditions with the support of the government, because the federal government adopted a law, Bill C-60, that says that Treasury Board will give the mandate to bargain to Canada Post, and that the Treasury Board will be sitting at the bargaining table. So we can see that there's collusion between the government and Canada Post. And as somebody else said in the room, it's a political battle. It's a political fight from the beginning to the end when we look at the situation we're in. And that is why our NEB adopted an action plan that tries to fight this political battle at the House of Commons, for example, and if we don't succeed at the House of Commons, we'll be fighting in the next election. We're involved. That's obvious. Then there's a question of how can we stop the termination of home delivery, which, if it happens in the next 5 years, will cut 5,000 to 6,000 jobs. So we're working with municipalities throughout Canada to try and block this move of Canada Post. One of the great weaknesses of the employer is that they acted unilaterally without consulting anyone. Now, for municipalities, this change is important because it will have an impact on the mapping of the municipalities. So municipalities want to be consulted. So we've been preparing petitions. We've been meeting people. Our members are going door to door. We've got local presidents and directors of regions who've organized days of going door to door. Some have organized the 3rd of May and 10th of May to go visit the population. So for us, municipalities are really important. If we can have municipalities ask Canada Post to consult, this will block this process. Now, the government could expropriate people to get land to put up community mailboxes, and we're looking at all these ways to try and block the employer. We're going to have the convention of the Canadian Federation of Municipalities, and we'll be discussing with them. Yesterday, we were discussing of how can we create a coalition. We have to build this coalition of allies. So we have the support of the union movement, because the union movement understands that the Postal Service is part of a strategy of change, but we also need support from groups representing seniors, people with disabilities, and groups that are directly involved. But we also have unity, as in the United States. There's the unity of the union movement. We have all groups that are unionized in Canada Post are working together. We're working together because we understand the negative impact these changes could have. But at the same time, we try to develop our vision, because the question of banking services is part of our vision for the future. Now, Canada Post is speaking of cuts, and we have developed the possibility of expanding services. In a way, our vision of the future is in the possibility of improving the postal service for everyone, including banking services. Here we speak about fair postal rates. Canada Post was profitable during 17 of the last 18 years. Once it becomes self-sufficient in blocking home delivery, we'll have to restart home delivery. Yesterday, we saw the importance in other countries of contact with citizens. The contact between the letter carrier and the citizen is very important. Keeping post offices open with reasonable working hours, not hours when it's inaccessible to citizens, because CPC is trying to reduce the hours to force citizens and customers to go to other services. But this fight is a midterm fight. We have to prepare for this fight. We want to force the government to go forward and add services. So our strategy is what is explained in the document explained or prepared by John. We want to create a working group with the government to go forward. But here we can see what happened in Italy. The Italian post office, they said, well, the government can do what we want. We will buy a bank. And that way we can develop banking services within the postal service. And they continue to have green postal services. Now, what should we do? Should we have 5 different vehicles serving a house? Now, we all know that packages are the future. Do you want to have 5 different trucks serving every home? We want to encourage green service and public universal postal service. That's our vision. That's our plan. A plan that's based on the experience we've had in our previous struggles with Canada Post. So that's our plan. And in that context, this symposium is an active part. So we prepared documents we had research done on privatization. We said in this symposium, we'll be able to communicate the experience in other countries of postal banking. We have seen that there are different models, and that's important because you can tailor what you do to the needs of the country. Now, the NEB will be looking into this and say, based on the experience of other countries, can we develop a model for Canada that we can propose to government and to the CPC? But we know one thing. What we know is that the Postal Bank, with its social aspects, with its way of seeing the response to urgent needs in the population, it's so important that we have to continue working. We see that a need exists. The study confirmed that need. But now we see that it's a crying need. We have a crying need for a postal bank. This symposium, this conference, motivates us to continue our debate, our work, and also to continue the debate with you, all those who participated in this conference, because we can see that what's happening in the different countries will evolve, and based on this evolution, I believe we'll be able to go forward. So that's an answer to Nicolas' question. I was maybe a bit long, but I also want to use this opportunity to present the point of view of our union and what we intend to do. Now, in the CUPW for the last 50 years, we had a slogan that was created in the 1960s. The slogan was, "The struggle continues." And that slogan is more and more necessary. The struggle does continue. I don't know if that answer is sufficient. Is there anyone else in the room who wants to add to these comments? If not, it's 1 p.m. We have a meal waiting for us. But in closing, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all the participants to this conference. It was very enjoyable. I'd like to thank also our speakers. The sharing of information has been a major element that will lead us to continue the debate. When we see the diversity of banking models around the world, it makes it very interesting. And all the presentations will be on our website. So if you want to have access to these PowerPoints, they will be on our website. And even the audio and the video will be available on our website. And we grant you access to all of this. So once again, I would like to thank all our speakers for the importance of their presentations. And we have ideas to continue. We've already established certain dates for activities where we can advance the idea of a postal bank. I'd also like to thank all those who listen to us on the internet, on live streaming. For us, it was a first experience of live streaming. It's a first experience for our members who can participate from home. Now, new technologies exist. We have to use them properly. And allowing our members to share in this conference over the internet is a proper use of new technology. So thank you all who are on the internet. I'd also like to thank our staff, people who organize this symposium. You know, it takes quite a machinery to organize a symposium. There's a technical side, but there's the preparation of the agenda, there's the invitation of guests, there's the research for speakers. So I'd like to thank the staff of CUPW and COPE and other unions in the CUPW. It's important to thank everyone who've worked so hard. So thank you very much also the interpreters, English, French, and sign language. Thank you very much. That was important. I'd like to thank the technicians responsible for the live streaming. They've got lots of wires. With all these wires, I don't know how they managed to connect it properly. It's mind-boggling. And thank you, participants, for being with us for these 2 interesting days. For us, the struggle continues. This Thursday will be May 1st, the International Day of Workers. Historically, it's been a very important day. There are demonstrations being organized throughout the country, one in Ottawa, one in Montreal, others in Winnipeg and Vancouver and Halifax. So, we are organizing these demonstrations to point out the historic struggle of workers and to present our will to change things, to change this society. So I'd also encourage you to participate in these activities. And a good trip home. I'll invite you to stay because a meal is being served. So you can continue to discuss among yourselves during this meal. And once again, thank you. And have a good trip home. And we in CUPW, we have a tradition. We often and we always conclude our meetings. People will say that's the stereotype of CUPT, but we finish with saying
solidarité. Solidarité. Donc, thank you. Merci.
thank you.